As a concerned citizen, there are a million ways to get your voice heard. You can shout out of the window, you can share every thought that zips through your bonds with a million like-minded twits on Twitter, or you can get your own low-budget BBC 4 show and sit monotonously blarping words down the lens over and over again until all the viewers at home switch over to something more entertaining, such as Anti-Deck senselessly killing a dog or something. But useful though all these platforms are, chances are no one's going to take your message seriously until you gather like-minded people together and march through a major city in your thousands, waving placards and chanting slogans. Protests are effective, that's why the Iraq War never happened.
Of course, sometimes demonstrations turn unpleasant, which is bad news for public order, but a veritable bonanza for news networks and the press. Recently, as those world leaders gathered in London for that G20 party, the news excitedly prepared us for the biggest display of public dissent in years.
Not just the biggest, but the most varied too.
There was a protest for just about everything: anti-capitalism, anti-carbon trading, anti-war, anti-wasps, you name it.
In fact, there were so many protesters, Newsnight had to provide a guide to who they were.
There were knackered-looking pacifists, the lead singer from the Flaming Lips, the most earnest man in the world, and an anarchist professor.
We are not protesting. We are overthrowing the government.
Yeah, though he seemed a tad less ominous than that when you saw him going down a kiddie slide.
So there you go, a varied bunch, but still the news was worried.
In fact, given the tone of some of the preemptive coverage in the press, you could have been forgiven for thinking everyone was marching in favour of simply smashing everything in the world to bits.
There were also stories about bankers being told to dress down, although not everyone in the city seemed that bothered.
So in no sense will you allow this process to stop you coming to work?
I shall try not to.
Well, where do you work, the 1930s?
GMTV kept its viewers informed with a helpful VT in which benevolent, stereotypical, crusty environmental types stood around in front of a peace flag, patiently responding to questions about potential trouble.
We hope that, a lot of people come together and create a lot of change.
Not very scary, really. Still, at least they didn't try to oomph things up by slapping together a montage of violent-looking protest material backed with I Predict a Riot by the Kaiser Chiefs.
They also interviewed this climate change protester who said,
"With the situation of climate change being as urgent as it is and as important as it is, we do think it is acceptable to sometimes break the law."
Now, I think when she talks about breaking laws there, she's actually referring to the environmental protesters' plan to erect a little temporary tent city in the street. But GMTV's John Stapleton seemed to take it as a violent anarchist mission statement, a point he repeatedly put to Mark Barrett of the G20 Alliance.
Well, you were saying let's have a peaceable protest, but as you saw from that young lady at the end there, that's not likely to be the case. There are people going there intent on causing trouble.
Well, to be fair to that lady at the end, she represents the Climate Camp, and they're very much a peaceful movement, and they're all about practical solutions.
But she accepts violence may take place.
She didn't say violence. She said that.
Oh, Stapleton's a tit, isn't he?
To get the ideas into the public realm, sometimes we have to do something that's a little bit different.
So I come back to my point, violence may occur.
It's admirable of GMTV to have hired a totally deaf host.
But you know as well as I do that on some websites that there are people advocating, quote, burn a banker, causing mayhem.
Yeah.
You can't justify that. You must accept there is the risk, given the numbers involved and given the sort of language that's been used by some of the people, not you personally, but other people, there is a real risk of this turning into mayhem, lockdown in the city, and, monumental cost to taxpayers.
Still, in case you weren't put off by all the continued references to potential violence, then hooray!
yes, because as well as dire warnings, the papers and the news bulletins were jam-packed with helpful step-by-step advertising campaigns showing precisely where, when and how the massive bloody rucks they were predicting would take place.
OK, so we start there.
We'll move across the City of London.
And go there.
Congregate at the Bank of England.
And then it kicks off there.
Saturday brought a Put People First march in which charity supporters, churchgoers, concerned citizens and Carol of Big Brother 8 demanded an end to all unpleasantness. The news networks covered this patiently.
This passed off peacefully, but never mind, everyone knew Wednesday was going to be the real flashpoint.
Come Financial Fool's Day itself, the rolling news stations leapt into action, prepared to cover every aspect of the demonstrations. Windows were boarded up in preparation, the news media assembled, the horsemen of the apocalypse cantered into view, and the violence began. Not.
In fact, it all seemed rather cheerful for a while. It was all a bit Glastonbury.
Adding to the epic festival vibe, Sky News cracked out the Skycopter, which hovered around all day, zooming in on anything that looked vaguely troublesome, a bit like a gorilla picking through a mate's fur for uppity lice.
But why stop with commanding the air when you can also throw live to the skyboat? Not the riverboat, no, the sky boat, which is like a riverboat, but with a rather lost-looking poor sod standing in the middle of it.
And you can probably see the first of what looks like banners from the protesters. That, of course, the south end of the bridge. We're right in the middle of the river.
Wow, what a vantage point that's not.
They also had Ian Woods on the ground in his sky shoes. He was moving through the crowd a bit like an uptight businessman character wandering through a psychedelic party in a happening 60s movie. A movie complete with unexpected celebrity cameos. Hang on, wait a minute, is that, it's
Russell Brand.
That's it.
Protests.
Yes, the nation's favourite bearded lexicographer and sex machine had arrived and was already scanning his surroundings for fresh granddaughters to fuck.
Russell, you're live on Sky News at the moment. Can you just explain why you've come here today? Which issue angers you?
I ain't angry.
No, aren't you? OK. Tell us about your dinkle.
So why come?
I live here.
I thought you lived in Ponderland. By now the crowds were building and the air began to turn. One of Sky's correspondents got so excited he ejaculated while on the phone to Dermot Murnahan.
Okay. Alistair Bundle there, somewhere within that crowd. He was just telling us his cum.
Shortly afterwards, Tony Benn, who was about to go on an anti-war march to Trafalgar Square, offered Dermot a little editorial advice.
The coverage of this, if I may make a suggestion to you, would be to try to cover some of the speeches made today. Otherwise, if it's just described as demonstrations, scuffles, police, traffic, no one outside will really know what it's really about.
Yeah, whatever, Tony, it's kicking off down the road.
Yeah, a little later, things started looking a touch more feisty, although some of the assembled pundits initially seemed to find it all rather comical.
And here we are with scenes which, by and large, are more reminiscent of carry-on camping.
Around this point, a bit of genuine ugliness occurred.
Sky captured a sort of ninja protester hitting police with a pole and another man who appeared to receive a blow to the head. Bleeding from a wound, he moved forward to repeatedly shout at the police.
There's a young man quite clearly goading the police. Ali's getting very worked up indeed.
Shouty McHeadwound Man was destined to become the first iconic image of the protest.
This seems to be the ringleader at the moment, very keen to get to the front.
Clearly this wasn't very nice, but even while this was going on, just a short distance away, things were so relaxed, Sky's Ian Woods was looking downright bored. Although maybe things had calmed down because the police had deployed a giant.
Meanwhile, on the BBC, there was a chance to see a small group of people possessed by demons and take a look at some exciting anti-establishment graffiti.
Now, if you just take a quick look behind me on the walls of the Bank of England, I think you can probably see where protesters have been scrawling graffiti, slogans like money is for losers and property is theft.
And stop the bullshit. Go back, it said stop the bullshit. Go on, read it out.
A bit later after that, a few headstrong protesters, who the police had kettled in near an undefended branch of the Royal Bank of Scotland, started smashing windows.
Predictably, this became the second iconic image of the protests. It was certainly captured on enough cameras. Honestly, with all the lenses swarming around, you'd have thought Paris Hilton's vagina was smashing the bank up. Despite these flurries of violence, while it was happening, the reporters were still keen to get across how peaceful the majority of the demonstration was. Having said that, they still didn't really broadcast those speeches Tony Benn was so keen on. They got mentioned in split screen, but that was about it. Compare that with the scene a few days later where speeches from Jade Goody's funeral ceremony were broadcast at length.
You made me feel so special and soothed away my fears.
But then she's famous, what are you going to do? Anyway, as far as the protests went, throughout the day, the news did a fair job of contrasting the ugly bits with the more pleasant bits, especially from the skyboat where it was completely tranquil.
There's been very little to show that there's even been a demonstration here. If Richie just points up at the building, you can see that there's the Smash Capitalism banner that's been up there all day. But apart from that, absolutely nothing else.
By the evening bulletins, however, something had changed.
The events of the day had to be compressed, which meant even as the voiceover pointed out the majority of the protesters were peaceful.
Meanwhile, in the city, one branch of RBS takes the brunt of what are mainly peaceful protests.
These sensational pictures left a different impression.
And of course, Shouty McHeadwound Man got a thorough airing.
His confrontational moment in the spotlight was repeated again and again and again.
Why, he was an overnight sensation.
Already he's appearing on T-shirts, being profiled in glossy upbeat celebrity magazines, and hey, everyone's doing the Shouty McHeadwound dance!
This seems to be the ringleader at the moment, very keen to get to the front, get to the front. There's a young man quite clearly goading the police there.
The guy is bleeding quite heavily from his head as well.
Very keen to get to the front.
Obviously, dynamic images like these are going to drown out the voice of the peaceful majority every time, confirming the prejudice of many observers in the process.
That's certainly what happened across the pond, where on fair and balanced Fox News, turtle-faced unfunny man Bill O'Reilly shared his opinion of the protesters.
Authorities estimate about 4,000 loons are roaming around London right now. Some of them trying to cause trouble as President Obama and other world leaders are trying to right the economy.
Shouty McHeadwound man!
From what we've seen, there are basically three groups of loons. Anti-capitalists who want universal communism, environmental extremists who have a litany of complaints, and anti-war folks who want to give peace a chance while bin Laden and his crew cut off people's heads.
The next day, a huge protest at the Excel Centre itself turned out to be a damp squib. But never mind, because the papers were full of predictable headlines and images of the previous day's violence.
And buried away within, a few reports on what looked like, in news terms, a small story. It got a few scant mentions, usually alongside talk of brave police medics doing their job under difficult conditions. And here was the irony. At a public event granted absolute saturation coverage with all the press photographers, live feed images, skycopters, preposterous skyboats and all, the news had missed perhaps the most important image of the day.
In the end, it took some old-fashioned investigative reporting and a member of the public to bring this image to the nation's attention. Disturbing footage of a man being pushed over by the police. Shortly afterwards, he died of a heart attack.
In capturing this, the member of the public, ironically a New York fund manager, was technically breaking a law introduced on February the 16th, making it illegal to photograph the police. And so was the civilian who took this charming snap, appearing to show a police medic in action. Maybe the baton's full of medicine.
On top of that, just before this episode went to air, new alarming mobile phone footage came to light from the following day, appearing to show a policeman striking a female protester. In summary, this varied assembly of concerned citizens, some earnest, some violent, some daft, failed to get its voice heard with much coherence, and in the end the story became not about capitalism or climate change, but the succession of ugly images. The G20 demos didn't just inspire the news, they've also inspired a short little poem from our verse correspondent Tim Key.
Right, so this is a poem about the protests on April the 1st, you know, when everyone went down and it all kicked off a bit in the city. Petal got some metal and smashed a window. Anil threw his flannel. He's a Hindu. I suppose it's about the... everyone was doing it, you know, everyone just went down there. Hindus, Christians, skinheads, black, yellow, pink, grey, blue, everyone get down there, and as long as you hate the police and banks, you're away.